Have you ever imagined how the story of a man who received the most extraordinary wisdom from God the world has ever known ends? Today, we will dive into the final moments of King Solomon's life, the one who enjoyed unimaginable riches, unparalleled power, and above all, a brilliant mind gifted by the Creator himself. But was all this divine favor enough to keep him steadfast until the end? How could someone so blessed end his days in repentance and spiritual loneliness? In this journey, you will discover a rarely explored chapter, the conclusion of a king who, in his last moments, recognized that everything was vanity. We will uncover the mistakes that distanced him from God and the tragic consequences that this choice brought upon him. More than just telling an ancient story, we will reflect on what these lessons mean for each of us, who often fight the same battle against pride, temptation, and the illusions of this world. And if you enjoy content that brings you closer to biblical truths, subscribe to our channel right now. This way, you won't miss any of our upcoming videos where we present narratives full of emotion and teachings that can transform your life. Stay until the end to discover how Solomon's mistakes can warn us and how his last words still resonate strongly in our days. Prepare yourself for an intense story, full of twists and discoveries that can change the way you view your own journey. Let's begin. Solomon's reign began extraordinarily, carrying within it an incomparable promise. He was the son of King David, the great hero of Israel, and Bathsheba, who also endured many trials to reach this moment. From the beginning, we see that Solomon was specially chosen by God to ascend the throne after his father's reign, and the divine hand was evident in every detail of his journey. One of the most striking passages appears in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5. There, we see that the Lord revealed himself to Solomon in a dream at Gibeon and made him an offer that few have had in history. Ask for whatever you want me to give you. This divine proposal reflected not only God's favor, but also the trust the Creator placed in Solomon to lead his people. And it was here that Solomon's character uniquely manifested. Instead of requesting unlimited wealth, a long life full of privileges, or the destruction of his enemies, requests that any powerful leader might make, Solomon surprised everyone by choosing what would forever change the history of his reign. He asked for wisdom to discern between good and evil, to lead Israel with justice, and to honor the commitment God had established with his family. This attitude of the young king not only marked the beginning of a distinctive leadership, but also defined his legacy. Solomon was recognized as the wisest man of all time, whose decisions served as a reference for future generations. However, his story is not made only of victories and prosperity. There are profound lessons about pride, temptation, and the consequences of turning away from God. It is precisely this mix of extraordinary gifts and misguided choices that makes Solomon's journey so impactful for all of us. Now, prepare to dive into every detail of this royal adventure, which begins with an incredible demonstration of humility before the Creator, and throughout the chapters, transforms into a valuable warning for our own steps in life. Even in the face of such a generous invitation from God, Solomon did not ask for wealth, success, or power. In 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 9, we see that he humbly chose, "Give me a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" God's response to this request was astounding. In 1 Kings 3:10-14, the Lord was so pleased with Solomon's plea that, in addition to granting him wisdom like no other man had ever had, he also promised great riches, honor among nations, and a long life, but all with one condition, that Solomon obeyed God's commandments, and soon this wisdom would be put to the test. Still, in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 16-28, two women came before the king, each claiming to be the true mother of the same baby. The way Solomon resolved this dispute became legendary. He suggested dividing the living child into two parts, predicting that the true mother would prefer to give up her right to see her child dead. The compassion of the true mother revealed who was, in fact, the legitimate one. This shrewd judgment impressed all the people of Israel, as they saw not only the wisdom of a man, but the presence of God's own wisdom acting through their king. From that moment on, Solomon's fame quickly spread beyond the borders of Israel. The text of 1 Kings 4:29-30 shows that the wisdom granted by God to the king was as vast as the sand on the seashore, surpassing even the remarkable knowledge of the eastern peoples and the wise Egyptians. But what made Solomon so special? Besides his fair decisions and deep discernment, he excelled in producing texts that inspire generations to this day. According to 1 Kings 4:32, Solomon wrote about 3,000 proverbs and more than 1,000 songs. These works went far beyond simple religious reflections. They dealt with people's daily lives, the mysteries of nature, the challenges of leadership, and above all, the relationship between humans and God. Every word highlighted the divine gift he had received. The influence of the king of Israel was so great that it aroused the curiosity of distant rulers, such as the renowned Queen of Sheba. The long journey she undertook to reach Jerusalem was no accident. She came with complex questions, willing to test the extent of Solomon's knowledge. However, she was greatly astonished when she realized that everything she had heard about him was still little compared to what she witnessed personally. In 1 Kings 10:6-7, she acknowledges that Solomon's ability to answer even the most difficult questions exceeded all expectations, and the divine favor rested not only on the king, but also on the entire nation of Israel. This visit from the Queen of Sheba confirmed the impact Solomon's wisdom had beyond the Israelite borders. The brilliance of his words and deeds helped elevate the prestige of his kingdom, transforming Israel into a center of pursuit for knowledge and counsel. Solomon's testimony increasingly made it evident that when God grants a gift, he does so not only to bless one person, but for that blessing to be reflected in the lives of many. Are you enjoying the story of King Solomon? Bless this video with your like. Jesus loves you. Among all of Solomon's achievements, perhaps the most notable was the construction of the Great Temple in Jerusalem, a project that his father, David, had dreamed of completing, but fell to Solomon to finish. According to 1 Kings 6, this temple was built with extreme care and splendor. The best cedar from Lebanon was used, along with abundant gold, silver, and bronze. For 7 years, a vast team worked to make this work the spiritual heart of Israel, a visible symbol of God's covenant with his people. After the construction was completed, recorded in 1 Kings 8:10-11, the divine presence filled the place so intensely that even the priests could not stand. Then Solomon led all the people in a touching dedication ceremony. In chapter 8, verses 22-53, we find the essence of this prayer, where the king acknowledges the greatness of the Lord, asking him to hear and forgive his people whenever they turn to the temple in search of mercy. Verse 23 encapsulates the heart of this plea, exalting God's sovereignty and pleading for his divine care. Under Solomon's reign, Israel reached an unprecedented level of prosperity and prestige. Merchants, scholars, and leaders from various nations were drawn to the kingdom's splendor and the fame of his wisdom. With each visit, God's favor upon Israel was confirmed, demonstrated not only in material wealth, but above all in the solidity of a faith that had the temple as its pinnacle of worship. According to 1 Kings 10:23-24, Solomon became the wealthiest and wisest monarch of his time, so much so that people from various regions traveled just to hear him and learn from the wisdom God had placed in his heart. His commercial dominance extended from Egypt to Mesopotamia, bringing tributes in gold, silver, ivory, monkeys, and even peacocks. 1 Kings 10:22. As we see in 1 Kings 10:14, Solomon alone received 666 talents of gold per year, the equivalent of over 25 tons. All this splendor was reflected in his palace. His throne, described in 1 Kings 10:18-20, was made of ivory overlaid with pure gold, featuring 6 steps flanked by lions, one on each side. To complete the scene, remember 1 Kings 10:21 states that all the utensils used by Solomon were made of gold, as silver was considered so common that it held little value in his days. Despite all this shine, such prosperity brought a new trial for the king's heart. The temptation that arises in the face of such wealth is a reminder that not even great wisdom is enough to free us from the dangers of pride and vanity. As Solomon extended his alliances with neighboring nations, he also engaged in relationships forbidden by God's commandments. In 1 Kings 11:1-2, we see that the king loved many women from peoples like Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and even the Hittites, exactly those whom the Lord had commanded the Israelites not to take as wives, so they would not be led to worship strange gods. Still, Solomon ignored this warning. According to 1 Kings 11:3, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, which clearly violated the instruction in Deuteronomy 17:17, which prohibited the king from multiplying wives. Over time, the influence of these women was decisive in turning Solomon's heart toward other gods, as described in 1 Kings 11:4, distancing him from the commitment he had made to the Lord. In an even more grave act of disobedience, Solomon authorized the construction of altars and high places where sacrifices were offered to foreign deities. Thus, the king, who was once recognized for the wisdom given by God, allowed his love for these women and the breaking of commandments to distance himself from full devotion to the God of Israel. Even having received unparalleled wisdom, Solomon began to build altars to deities completely opposed to the God of Israel. In 1 Kings 11:5, we discover that he erected places of worship for Ashtoreth, the goddess venerated by the Sidonians, associated with fertility and sensuality, something that openly contradicted the Lord's holiness. Moreover, according to 1 Kings 11:78, Solomon also built high places for Chemosh, the Moabite god, and for Moloch, an Ammonite deity whose worship included child sacrifices, a practice considered abominable in God's eyes. The most serious aspect is that these actions went against direct instructions from the Creator himself. In Deuteronomy 12:2-3, the Lord had ordered the destruction of pagan sanctuaries, not the erection of new ones. Therefore, Solomon's decision was not merely an act of cultural tolerance, but a clear act of disobedience. Here, we see the harsh irony of his story. The very wisdom Solomon had asked for to distinguish between good and evil was overshadowed by idolatrous compromises. Since the days of Moses, in Deuteronomy 7:3-4, God had warned the people to avoid marriages with foreign nations that could lead Israel to serve other gods. But despite these warnings, Solomon's heart strayed, and he entered into alliances that distanced him from the Lord. When we contrast his trajectory with that of his father David, which, even with serious mistakes, never ceased to turn back to God, we realize how far Solomon and his kingdom had drifted from divine purposes. The Lord's wrath, described later, shows how much this attitude hurt the relationship that had once been the strongest mark of Solomon's reign. The Lord had revealed himself to Solomon on 2 occasions, both at Gibeon and in Jerusalem, always renewing his promises and reminding the king to faithfully obey the commandments. In 1 Kings 9:6-7, God makes it clear that if Solomon and his descendants turned away from him to serve idols, Israel would be removed from the land the Creator had given his people. Nevertheless, Solomon continued to build sanctuaries for other deities and participate in pagan rituals. In 1 Kings 11:9-10, we read that the Lord became angry with him because his heart had turned away from the one who had appeared to him more than once, warning him not to follow strange gods. Unfortunately, all the wisdom, wealth, and heavenly favors were overshadowed by idolatry. This situation culminated in a drastic announcement. In 1 Kings 11:11, the Lord declares that because Solomon had broken the covenant and ignored divine statutes, the kingdom would be torn away from his hands and given to a servant. Thus, that glorious empire, once sustained by God's blessing, began to move toward division and conflict. The tragedy in Solomon's life is a warning to anyone who thinks they are secure in their achievements, showing that without faithfulness to the Lord, even the greatest kingdoms can crumble. And you, are you being faithful to God? Have you been following His commandments? Tell me in the comments. God's judgment on Solomon was swift and firm, but also full of mercy. Because of the love God had for David, Solomon's father, He decided not to take away the kingdom immediately during Solomon's lifetime. Instead, the full responsibility for the consequences would fall on Solomon's son, Rehoboam, as described in 1 Kings 11:12-13. This divine decision was a direct response to Solomon's unfaithfulness. Despite being chosen by God and blessed with so much wisdom, Solomon allowed his heart to stray drastically. In 1 Kings 11:29-31, we see a clear example of this when the prophet Elijah, sometimes referred to as Elias, but here it seems to be a reference to another prophet, possibly Jehu or another, given the context of Jeroboam, meets with Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officials. Jeroboam came from outside Jerusalem, and the prophet took his new cloak, tearing it into 12 pieces. He gave 10 of these pieces to Jeroboam, saying, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, has said. I am going to tear the kingdom away from Solomon's hand and give it to you, dividing it into 10 tribes." This symbolic act represented the imminent division of the kingdom of Israel, a testament to the seriousness of Solomon's disobedience. On the last day of his life, King Solomon, who was once recognized as the wisest and richest man on earth, sat in his palace to reflect on the splendor that had characterized his reign. His life was marked by impressive achievements, wisdom that fascinated entire nations, incomparable wealth, and a kingdom that reached the peak of its power under his leadership. However, despite all these successes, Solomon's final moments were dark and filled with sorrow. Solomon's reflection on that last day was not filled with the joy and pride that his accomplishments might have provided. Instead, he faced the reality of the choices that had distanced him from God, culminating in the imminent division of the kingdom he had so diligently built with so much effort and divine blessing. This tragic ending serves as a powerful reminder that even the greatest leaders can be vulnerable to temptations and deviations, emphasizing the importance of faithfulness and continuous devotion to God. With all of God's promises and grand achievements, Solomon's life came to its final days, marked by a profound sense of loss and repentance. The reflections of this great king are poignantly captured in the book of Ecclesiastes, often associated with his final years. In Ecclesiastes 1:2, Solomon laments, "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." These words reveal the emptiness he felt, looking back on a life that had deviated from its original purpose. Despite all the wisdom he was given, Solomon realized that he had lost sight of the God who had given him everything. As he sat in his majestic palace, his mind wandered through the years of his reign. He remembered the day he dedicated the temple, a grand and sacred construction intended to honor the Lord. As described in 1 Kings 8, Solomon had fervently prayed for God's presence to fill that holy place, and the glory of the Lord descended like a cloud, confirming the divine blessing on his work. However, now Solomon's heart was distant from those days of devotion. In Ecclesiastes 2:10-11, he reflects on the futility of his pursuits. "I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my efforts. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun." Solomon's immense wealth allowed him to enjoy all possible pleasures. He built great palaces, planted vineyards, amassed treasures, and imported exotic animals. He had hundreds of servants and musicians to entertain him, but in his old age, all these dreams seemed empty and meaningless. Solomon had pursued everything the world had to offer, but in the process, he lost his spiritual direction. The king, who was once recognized as the wisest man, now understood that all his dreams and achievements were insignificant without God. In Ecclesiastes 5:10, he highlights the futility of material pursuits. "Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless." Solomon learned, albeit belatedly, that the desires of his heart had led him away from God's path. In the silence of his final days, Solomon reflected on the choices that led him to spiritual ruin. He acknowledged that despite all the blessings and achievements, nothing had value without true devotion to the Lord. This tragic realization serves as a powerful lesson for all of us. True wisdom and happiness are not found in wealth or earthly pleasures, but in faithfulness and relationship with God. When he was young, Solomon enjoyed a very close relationship with God. He built the temple in Jerusalem as a symbol of the divine presence among his people, fulfilling his father David's desire. However, as the years passed, his many marital alliances with foreign women and his commitments to idolatry began to distance him from the Lord. Solomon had abandoned his first love, the God of his youth, who appeared in his dreams and granted him unparalleled wisdom. In the scriptures, we see a man who experienced the highs and lows of life. In Proverbs 3:5-6, Solomon advises, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." However, he failed to follow this advice. Instead of fully trusting God, Solomon relied on his own wisdom and sought earthly pleasures, deviating from the direct path God had laid out for him. In the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verse 13, Solomon offers a final piece of advice that summarizes his reflections. "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." These words, written in his final days, reflect the deep understanding that true satisfaction only comes from obedience to God. Solomon's last day served as a somber reminder of the fleeting nature of earthly pursuits. Solomon had received great blessings from God, but squandered them by turning away from the Lord. In his final moments, he recognized that his wisdom, wealth, and power were useless without a heart dedicated to God. In Ecclesiastes 7:29, he expresses a touching truth. "This only have I found. God created mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes." Solomon, considered the wisest man of his time, fell victim to his own choices. His final reflections serve as a warning to all of us who seek fulfillment in worldly things, forgetting our relationship with God. Solomon's story is a powerful lesson on the importance of remaining faithful to God. His last day was not marked by celebrations, but by deep reflection on what he had lost. He began his life with so many promises, but his final years were clouded by excuses and deviations. The wisest king who ever lived learned, in the hardest way, that no amount of wealth, wisdom, or pleasure can replace a heart fully devoted to God. Let us be inspired by Solomon's final words and remember that our true purpose is not in the pursuit of material gains, but in fearing God and keeping his commandments. Solomon's legacy teaches us that life's greatest treasures are not in the possessions we accumulate, but in the relationship we cultivate with our Creator. Solomon's last day was not one of joy, but of pain, for a life that had strayed from God. Let us learn from his mistakes. It doesn't matter how our journey begins, but how it ends. Let us all strive to remain faithful to God until the end. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this content enlightening, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends and family. And remember, true wisdom comes from following God with all your heart, mind, and soul. I'm leaving 2 special videos here for you. One talks about the story of Job's suffering and how he continued to worship even after losing everything. And in the other, I tell the story of Samson and how he was betrayed by those he loved most. I'm sure you'll enjoy them. Take a look. See you next time.